Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And um, I want to say I enjoyed reading your book, but that wouldn't be the right terminology. That wouldn't be the word I would use. Um, I felt that it was incredibly enlightening, and I'm very grateful that you wrote it. How long ago did you write that book?
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, so thanks for mentioning the book right away. Yeah, so it's my, memoir,
Mhm.
and it's called Quest for Love, Memoir of a Child Sex Slave. And I started writing it really in 2004
Mhm.
and 2005. I was working on these issues back then. I had memories while writing the book. They just sort of flew out of my fingers, I could say. And 2 years ago, I was working on another book, which is about the healing modality I developed over the years. And I realized suddenly that I need to actually first put my story out. And
Mhm.
that afterwards, I need to put out the book, which focuses really on what is a solution, that I have in terms of bringing healing on a global and a personal level. So first, my story, though, that's the first thing that needs to be revealed, is that this darkness, this stain on humanity.
And it is quite a stain on humanity. I think when I first started looking into your story, and even before I read the book, but as I read the book, um, I think I had a similar reaction to the information that I'm assuming a lot of people have, which is that it's hard to wrap your mind around the idea that this is happening, not because we don't believe in the person, but because we can't imagine ourselves or someone we know doing it. Like our brain doesn't stretch to that place. Thank God. Thank God it doesn't.
Thank God.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in some ways that is the mark of a positive, healthy experience on the planet. And in other ways, it's hard to imagine a group of wealthy, men and some women who like to have sex with prepubescent children and torture and murder them. It seems it seems like something you read in a movie, but of course movies come from somewhere. How
Mm.
often do you deal with people's struggle to even enter the conversation?
Oh, all the time. Obviously, I've been public for 10 years, so I certainly have had my share. And this was really why I waited so long, because
Yeah.
I'm 60 now, so I was 49 when I'm in public. So the reason it took me so long was that I knew that I had to be ready for the attacks more than anything, that
Right.
I had to be strong enough, because I understand that very well. And I also understand, and it's interesting, it's yes, you don't have the experience, so it's really hard to believe that people can do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. And yes, thank God. On the other hand, there is something in our consciousness, in our united consciousness, that it is happening in the world. And why can't we see it? It's not just because it's so well hidden, but it's also hidden in our own consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
That's to say that our own darkest shadows are related to this as well. And I think that's really where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I'm going to start at the beginning, but I do want to touch on the fact that there's a narrative in the story about this perpetrator that you have this love affair with, and you are 11, 10, 11, and he's, I believe, in his 20s. And interesting how many people saw you together, and you describe all these places that you're together. And of course, there's a backstory, but it sounds like it's a weak backstory that people could have poked holes in relatively easily. But I had that thought of what are we choosing not to see? How much are we paying attention, when we see things that don't add up, and where's our brain filling in the gaps to make it make sense?
Absolutely. And that was the perpetrator, of course, that's mostly described in the book, which was a young gangster. He was 20 when I met him when I was 10. Had been in a network for 4 years back then.
Yeah.
But before that, I was brought to the United States by a perpetrator who took me shopping on Madison Avenue.
Right. Right.
And there too, nobody, just because of the sheer power of this person, nobody would ever question him. Maybe now, post Jeffrey Epstein, I guess, maybe now people would ask questions. I don't know, because when people have that much power, people around them tend to ask very few questions anyway.
Yeah. 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 It's, I think we must all be guilty of some form of it. I think it's almost like looking at our unconscious bias. Where do we turn a blind eye, and how much can we change? And that's why these conversations are really important, so that we can have new information and stop filling in those gaps. I think that with information, because we're really filling it in with something that makes sense to us, not what makes sense in reality, right? Not we're not able to stretch to the story that's real because we can't imagine it.
And I think that has to do with us not being psychopaths.
Right. I mean, that actually, that I had a therapist once say to me exactly that. If you could understand, then you would be like them, and you can't understand because you're not like them. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And a part of that narcissism, that extreme narcissism, is about getting away with things. That's what kind of the thrill of power is, to be able to get away with things in front of people. So that was a lot of the game. That remains a lot of the game. And then, of course, that we could never begin to imagine what is done behind closed doors, and how systemic it is, how the whole power structure is influenced by those psychopaths.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that everyone has these invitations to be greedy, has these invitations to, abuse power as soon as you have it. Everyone. And then when you get into steep power structures, you do get this same kind of being belonging means
Right.
shutting up about things that are happening, and often relating to sexual abuse. And it is when we say corruption, well, it does work on blackmail.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
And you
yeah.
don't get in unless you are already so depraved. That's to say that you keep making these choices as you climb in the power structure, in certain power structures, especially the toxic ones. But sort of the nature of the structure invites this power abuse. The closer you get, the more compromised you have to be. And that means every time making a choice against integrity, against personal integrity, and for power, for belonging. And what I try to show is that all of that behavior is actually trauma-based, but
Right.
we have a hard time just cognizing the depth of depravity of
Yeah.
what it means to be a psychopath when nothing means anything anymore. And that means it's just invitations to perpetrate from the position of power in every possible way, repeating your own trauma story from the place of power, which gives you a temporary sense of freedom, just like any addiction. You just get the relief for a moment, and you feel free because you don't have to carry that burden that was placed on you when you were traumatized. And you repeat that from the position of the perpetrator indefinitely, and in greater, it's symbolic, when let's say maybe a child is being killed, for the person who kills that child or the people that are there is a symbolic death that occurs in terms of how they died inside. and now they are actually killing a real child, and it means nothing to them because they have lost all connection to the heart, and they have uh, no awareness of an innate sense of right and wrong. So it's like nothing means anything for these people, and we don't know what that actually means, and the trauma that their trauma that's behind that, which they have no access to, and how they then keep repeating their trauma over and over again from the position of power in order to run from their trauma.
If you read the book and you understand how compromised these people like what they need to do to get to where they're part of this, and that they're so compromised, there's no turning back from that. So
that's right.
So even if they wanted to have some sort of different experience, they're not gonna turn back from that. And so it leads to a systemic response if other people are joining. I want to get into, one of the things that I think a lot of us picture, right, is you have the runaway who gets, abducted or picked up and brought into sex slavery, sold either internationally or, inner city, what have you. It is hard to imagine, as a mother, your mom decided she wanted to sell you into this pedophile ring. It couldn't have just been for money.
No, we were not poor.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you look back, maybe you don't make sense of it all and you don't need to, but how do you think about how she would have come to that decision?
Well, it wasn't a very conscious decision, that's for sure, but it was rather that she was probably targeted. And I know I was targeted through her because of her mental health condition, which was never diagnosed, but I say she's a psychopath.
Right. Well,
yeah.
She meets criteria.
And the female expression of that is often a woman who's extremely fawning to all men. So she was very flirtatious, always sort of like a little girl, but a sexualized little girl. That's how she acted to men everywhere. And she would let herself get humiliated by men. And then whatever was on the other end of that, there was this incredible sense of revenge, that she had power over me, and then I was really her only victim.
Because your brother wasn't.
My brother was definitely not sold into the network, but my brother is my half brother, and my stepfather was kind of looking out for him, but he was not looking out for me. So I think that she was targeted, my stepfather as well, who's not often home, and also extremely, very much in denial and really wanting to belong to that powerful group. But my parents were actually never themselves in the network. I think my mother would have wanted to be. See, for my mother, they were both climbers, my stepfather and my mother. They both came from poor working class backgrounds in Europe right after my stepfather was born before the war, or they were both born before the Second World War. My stepfather fought in it. My mother was a child in it when there was starvation in the town. The war did a lot of damage in Europe, and that was palpable when I was growing up. That trauma that was never healed. There was no healing for it. There were no resources. You were considered crazy if you did any therapy. So my mother's, what must be extensive sexual abuse, certainly, mixed with that war trauma, and the love she certainly did not receive, in her family. She wasn't well. She was, because she acted like a little child, like a little girl. I think that we were targeted when we moved into that town, into that village. And then basically I first had pimps, and then my mother took over from those pimps.
Mm. And she would drive you to these places where the network was having orgies or other type of parties, or
Yeah.
sound like some of them were just straight up almost brothels, and leave you there for sometimes for periods of time. Did you was any of that strange or surprising to you, or by that time were you so used to this? And how old were you when this started?
Yeah. So just finishing about my mother and her climbing and my
Mhm.
stepfather's climbing. So they really wanted to belong to
Mhm.
these powerful people, which were aristocrats, politicians. So they really wanted to belong. And my mother very much wanted to belong into that club, but she was never really invited in, but she did get paid. But it wasn't for money, but she did get paid.
Mhm.
Um, and she did start abusing me from birth, and we were alone at first. And then after she was married, um, I was 4 when she was married, and then at 5, these pimps, this woman started cleaning our house. And a year later, so this woman actually and her husband, they would take me for weekends. They would groom me. They would take me with other children who were not their children. And then just around my 6th birthday, they took me for the first time to an orgy. And then sometime later, my mother took me herself.
Mhm.
Um, Now, surprising, let's say that it was very difficult to live with my mother because her projection was complete, you could say. That's whoever I am was, there was no space for any of it.
Mm.
So with my mother, it was complete lie. I had to be this weak, bland, ugly little girl, and then I was good, or I had to be evil and powerful, and then I was bad. And there was nothing of me there. Now, in the network, as horrible as it was, sometimes there were little reflections from perpetrators that I could find myself. Let's say that I had a reflection, which, I guess children need these reflections for their emotional development. So that was more positive sometimes, not always, in the network than with my mother. It was very hard to be around her. So I was a different, had a different personality that came out for the network, sexualized, of course, and
Mhm.
uh, that was most of the time a little bit more comfortable in spite of the rapes. I mean, the rapes were there, and there were horrific things happening, absolutely. But then there was also being seen, being found
Mhm.
pretty, being seen as intelligent, or whatever it was that was being mirrored,
Yep.
that I also needed.
Yep. Yep. That you weren't getting met. So it's, in some ways it was more validating in a weird way than being at home.
Yeah.
When did you first realize that children were being murdered, or when did you first witness that?
The first time I was taken, I spoke out. So I was humiliated in some horrific. It was really, I've spoken about it before. It was in a castle, and it was very confusing because people were dressed like hippies,
Hmm.
but these were aristocrats that were having a costumed ball, and they were dressed as hippies, and so they were experimenting with all the drugs, but there were waiters with silver platters with drugs on them
Mm-hmm.
going around. So not really a hippie situation there. It was formal, and yet everybody was completely high. LSD, I'm sure, joints, but everything, people were very, very out of it. But I was abused on a stage, in a sick S&M thing. But most people were so out of it, they barely even noticed, even though it was extreme. But for me, I went to a place where I felt that if I didn't do something now, I would die inside. And so I was with that no, with that inside no, an inner strength came that I didn't feel mine. It didn't feel like it was me, but I was just straightened up. I was righted by it. And I spoke out to everyone saying that they can't do this to me and I'm going to make sure they all go to jail. And yeah, people didn't really even barely hear me, or they were too out of it. But I needed to do that. But then afterwards, I was taken from there, and I don't know where, if it was downstairs from that in that same castle or if I was taken someplace else. I don't remember that. But the handler there, that was someone who was sort of in charge of the children and organizing, and who was himself a pedophile. He um, he was the point of contact for the pimps that had taken me there. He took me separately to a basement, and he led me inside and then showed me a body. And this was a young woman, but it was very clear. It was so he was acting very nonchalant, like, we don't want anything to happen to you.
Right.
And it was just about, because I said I was going to tell on them. And so we didn't want me to tell on them. So I had to keep the secret. So right away, I was confronted with their practices, let's say.
And you were 6?
Yes.
It's I have 2 6-year-olds. It's, just really unimaginable. When you realized that your life was in danger, did you start to act differently?
Well, I was already very traumatized.
Right. Yes.
And the truth is that the first 3 years of my life, even though I was being traumatized by my mother, abused by my mother, I also had a caretaker who was very loving,
Mm.
which was in Brussels. So I had a mother, let's say, the first 3 years. So after my mother got married and we moved to Flanders, I got very sad.
Yeah.
And again, no reflection anywhere. I had that reflection from that wonderful lady. And then I didn't. And then there was nothing. Or there were people that were nice here and there, but I didn't really have that one person that I could trust. So I was already very sad and careful also. I had been groomed by those pimps also. And after that threat, I still wanted to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried. I had threatened to tell my stepfather, because he was the mayor of our little town. And I thought, well, I could tell my mother. But I also, it's not like I had any words to describe even what happened. There was no vocabulary as a 6-year-old, or I wouldn't have considered that this vocabulary that existed, which I didn't know, would have applied to me anyway. It's just all so incredibly
Right.
strange. But I did tell my mother that bad things had happened. And then she took over.
From the handlers.
from my pimps, she became my own pimp and then started. She actually got a car. She didn't have a car before. She didn't have a driver's license. She didn't know how to drive. She got her driver's license without having to take a driver's test because my father's stepfather was the mayor. And so she was very proud that she could do that. So she couldn't drive. And she got a very small car. It was the only automatic car available in Belgium at the time. It was a Dutch car, Dutch make named DAF, DAF, a daffodil. And then she was a dangerous driver. She never learned how to drive. She used that to drive me.
What were the people like in the network? You obviously they had power. Many people are going to picture monsters, right? That's what you can imagine, but they were all people ultimately. And were they all single? Were they all white? Did they have children, wives? Like what are the people who participate in this look like?
Well, I think energetically, I would say all of them are quite cold and arrogant.
Mm.
That would be the main thing that sets them apart. No heart. No genuine reactions. Very intelligent. So the network was a mix of depraved aristocracy, which I felt that they've been doing this for thousands of years, and this was what they do. And this is also indoctrinated into the families so that the children, they expose their own children to these, to sexual abuse. Sexual abuse and incest is normalized in those circles. And then there were people in certain positions of power. So there would be, an attorney, the attorney general, and another minister, and judges, and clergy, the cardinal, and man, I didn't know any of this. I just recognized them later.
Right.
I didn't know any of these people. I didn't know that they were powerful. I just had all the feelings and the fear, and the fear that comes with being or seeing the dark side of power, seeing what they do to maintain that position. Let's say that was the fear I had. It's not awe, but it's something like that. But it's completely rooted in fear. So they're not normal. They're popular. They have a big front. They have they were all white, and they have very good like their image is spotless. So, but it is an image. Whether they are, so I'm talking now about the Belgian network, but then there was the international network that I was also in for a short while, for a year. I was in the network from 69 to 74 in Belgium. And then from 72 to 73, I was taken into this international network.
Were all of the people involved in this interested in the torture and killing aspect? I think everybody on the planet's pretty familiar with pedophiles, people who are attracted to prepubescent children. The pedophile ring the network that you were a part of, had a key addition to it, which was this torture and murder aspect of it, which was another unique piece of it, I think.
Yeah.
Was that a requirement?
Well, let me first address something that you said, because the pedophiles are, to me, anyone who engages in any activity, sexual activity involving children. That's to say minors. not specific to prepubescent children. I don't want to separate the two out because that seems to me a ploy to make it easier to not
Right.
think of those people that are attracted to 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds.
Right.
Those men are also pedophiles, except that these people never thought of themselves as pedophiles,
Ah.
but they all were, because they didn't only have
Mm.
sex with children or rape children. They also had sex. They were just very addicted in general. But the power addiction, again, there's a triage that happens all the time. So within that, when I was talking about it being systemic, so it's like a club. And most of what the secret societies are is just really benefiting the communities, except that they are sworn to secrecy in really crazy ways. And the purpose of that, the reason for that secrecy really is only revealed at the top levels, which is always only by invitation. That's to say there's always a triage going on. And it's only people that are the right profile that will be invited into the top levels that are corruptible.
Mm.
So someone who has already been sexually abused and has a ton to prove, they're corruptible, they will be tested in certain ways. And then they will be titrated more and more deeply into
Mm-hmm.
what is then first pedophilia. And then it goes maybe to sacrifice, maybe an animal. But these people are profiled. And it's those who have the least qualms, who are the most psychopaths, who have these tendencies already, that will very quickly join and then reap the benefits, because of course they do control a lot,
Right.
and the rewards are real in the world. Now, spiritually, that's a whole other matter, but in the world, the benefits are there. So to have integrity and to say no when you're confronted with a child, then you're out. They may not be pedophiles, but at the very least, somebody who is in it is going to have to, at some point, witness
Mm. Mm.
a human sacrifice.
Is that so when we talk about human sacrifice, there's several instances in your book, some of which people want the details of, that can go and read the book. I will touch on them peripherally, which is, where children were killed, whether that was shot or had to be eliminated. It seemed to me like that was almost like a protocol, that either this person was no longer of use, or maybe they were concerned about the information getting out to the public, or whatever it was, that you couldn't have this many. It Was there a religious aspect to it? Because that part I didn't either hear or understand, of like, when you say sacrifice, it's for someone else, right?
Yes.
What was that about?
So in Belgium, in the Belgian network, at the time that I was used in it, from 69 to 74, they were not religious Satanists, no.
Okay.
But you had people that were completely sadistic,
Right. Yes, that's
that would kill children. And so they were given children to kill.
right. That they paid for them.
I don't know. I don't know if they paid or not. I don't know, their internal. I mean, I could usually tell who was more powerful than the next, but I try to stay away from those people as much as I could. I wasn't always successful, which is why I was exposed to some things. But when I was in the international, at 9 years old, I was gifted really to this powerful international networker who had a global profile. And suddenly that person decided that I was going to be his. And that involved a whole other level of indoctrination. And it also included that this person was like what I call like sincere Satanist. That's to say, sacrificing for Satan to the dark forces to have the power. It's a clear cut deal in a way, except not as clear cut, not that clear cut in that. But yes, they sold their soul. I mean, it was that. And it was religious because they had these kinds of festivities, let's say, which was horrific, but I've read a book about Dionysian orgies, and it was like that.
Tell us about that. I'm familiar.
So the Dionysian orgies in ancient Greek time, I believe that humans were sacrificed as well, but it's these crazy orgies that go on for days. And so people went completely wild. And for, again, those very messed up, traumatized beings that are in the network, they can just unload all their burdens in that during that time. But in the atmosphere, even though horrific things happen, there is a sense of togetherness. Even as it's more than that. It feels it's the replacement of spiritual feeling of togetherness, and it does come with a whole set of beliefs.
Okay.
That they adhere to. And of course, for all intents and purposes, they're saying, well, it's working because they do have the power.
Right. I mean, that technically is, technically, I guess that means it is working for them.
Well, it is working for them on that material level, as I say, and then they have this religious experience, I believe, in these horrendous moments, in these moments that if we were to view that, we would say, this is absolutely barbaric. But yet, that image of the Nazi who can kill someone horrendously and then listen to classical music. It's like that, their senses are in one way very refined, and their intelligence is extremely sharp. But their own lack of access to their own heart turns them into monsters, in that even that they need that high.
Right.
But it's all highs, and it's all, the experiences. I think ultimately it's the freedom from the burden that is placed on them during the trauma, but because of their power and because of their privilege and their entitlement, it gets put out so much more. It gets put out on their direct victims that is grossly physical rather than symbolic, so that they can keep running from their own pain. That's how I always saw it from a sort of psychological perspective.
Do you think that they did things and kept things so unbelievable that even if people spoke out, that they were going to be mocked? Because you hear about the Illuminati, and you hear, these are things that are in everyday parlance would be called conspiracy theories, right? And so in many ways, they do things that make it easy for someone coming out and talking about it to say, well, I mean, she's obviously believes XYZ.
Yeah. So that's, of course, a very common tactic, is that anyone who's a whistleblower is going to be considered crazy. A lot of survivors also end up in psychiatry
Mm-hmm.
which is not an accident. And then, of course, then they're completely labeled, mentally unwell and so forth. While in fact they're having memories and they're being pushed, into psychoses. Um, I am called. Um, I don't think you can call me a conspiracy theorist because I'm not a theorist. I'm speaking of my experience, but I have been called crazy. I have been called a liar and so forth. But when I was young, there was so little of this out.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't even programmed to not to speak out publicly because I don't think like,
Yeah.
not in a million years would they have ventured to believe that I might ever do that.
Right.
It was all about speaking to anybody at all. And the threats were all on the my personal level, and my indoctrination and my abuse was all about making sure I would not speak, that I would not speak to anyone. And the threat was if I ever spoke to anyone, they would always find out. It would always get back to them. They would punish not just me, but also the person that I would tell. So they always made it this very close circle. There is no way out. You will always remain helpless. There is nothing for you to do. You can never speak about it.
What was the healing process like? Where did it start? What was the first movement towards healing for you? Obviously, after not being abused would probably be step one. But beyond that, what was the first movement towards healing?
Yeah, so I do describe in the book, my rescue at age 11 with those very precise instructions that were given to me then,
Mm-hmm.
which I followed. And those first saved my life. Um, being told never to become a prostitute, that saved me because at 16 years old, I was actually in the Red District in Antwerp, and I would have just become a prostitute there and then maybe died, soon after. I don't know.
I think for the listeners who haven't read the book, to clarify, was you and this is so it's so much of your life is this dichotomy as I've read it, which is your rescuer was also a perpetrator, and that those instructions, a rescue feels like a benevolent
Yeah.
action, right? And
Right.
so when you describe a rescue, I'm thinking of a liberation. I'm thinking of, right, like we come in, we pull you out of a hole or whatever. But
Yeah.
your rescue was not like that. It
No.
was it was still self-serving in some ways, right? Your instructions from your perpetrator. Why don't you take us through the rescue? Because I think this story is really interesting, and it's a great um it's a great analogy for all of things that happened in your life where people were both,
Right.
good and evil all at the same time.
Right. Yeah, that was that gangster is definitely someone who killed a lot of people and talked about it, talked about liking
Mm-hmm.
that. I The first time I appealed to him a year earlier was when I went against him, and he was impressed by that. He liked that, in fact. And he had shared with me that he would put, when he was killing people, that he would put a gun to their heads because he said it puts you in touch with the truth of that person. They reveal their truth. And then when he had them in that situation, he started, showing his disgust, but basically would be someone trying to survive, their weakness in that moment of what he calls then betraying their friends. And then he would shoot them, and then he would feel this peace, this quiet afterwards, that and then he eventually told me his own trauma as a boy.
Right, his father, right?
Which had his father put a gun to his head, treat him as that traitor, except it was completely convoluted because it wasn't that situation. It wasn't the truth. It was that father's insanity who felt betrayed by his son when he found him in bed with his wife. So he felt the son who he was raping was betraying him rather than that the wife was, I mean, so crazy. So that trauma, that was his trauma. And he repeated that his whole life. And he killed people from that place of that boy feeling so ashamed and such a traitor in that moment, where there was no redemption for that boy. But he liked my strength, and he liked that I went against him. And in the end, I was going to be killed because of him, because he had dropped me. And when that started, and when I was being tortured in front of him by someone else, but he was there to see it, when that began, he laughed, and I defied him. And once again, I had the strength that came, doesn't feel like me. It just came from the depths, and it felt like a spiritual strength. And I thought, like, I don't need you. That no, there was again this no. And that completely confused him, because there again, he's confronted with what he felt was his weakness. And he is seeing this strength. And I think when people see that strength in someone, it gives them hope. So he set out to rescue me, and he went. And then while I was being tortured, he went, negotiated for my life to get me out, which was something that eventually did cost him his life. It was a good deed. It was selfless in that moment. It cost him his life. And when he took me home with those instructions, and he told me his whole story that I was able to piece together then later on, I feel that symbolically he gave me his story and his innocent child self to be redeemed, because I had that strength, that spiritual strength that he felt he lacked. So he was selfless in that moment, and maybe the only moment in his life that he was selfless, but it was selfless.
And his instructions to you, will you take us through those?
Yeah, sure. So it was never become a prostitute, never sleep with anyone for money, never buy drugs. You can take them, but only if they're given to you, and you can never do anything to get them. Don't become an alcoholic. You can have like 1 or 2 glasses of wine a night, never drink more than that. That was very clear. He said I should forget everything, forget him, and never speak of the network, never do it. I should marry. I should find someone my age, not an older man who made his own fortune, but someone my age from a wealthy family, preferably a family of New York bankers. And that's how I should marry. So I think that's about it. That's those were really very deep. These instructions did become my parent, and eventually put me in a situation long before the marriage. But I did end up marrying that profile of that man. That's why I could go to therapy.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Why I had that privilege then to heal,
Right.
because it is a privilege to be able to spend. I mean, I needed all the time. I really felt like I needed a lot more time because it's so heavy, so hard to care, to feel that all the repressed emotions of all that horror, all that pain, that grief. Oh, the horror, this the grief for the other children,
Yeah.
the grief for all the pain that was dumped on me, that I was also everything, feeling all that pain. Oh, once I started opening that box, oh boy. Now, there were always these points of light to keep me going. There was always some awareness. The integration process is beautiful and magical. And so I felt myself change and transform and grow. And that was definitely worth it. But it certainly was just hanging by a bare thread in terms of the progress many times, whereas the overwhelm of the darkness was very, very heavy to bear. But I could do it because of these instructions ultimately. And I started remembering things in the 80s. I had flashbacks in the 80s. I had really no context for any of it. I had suicide programming as well. So it wasn't really settling. And then I really didn't have a therapist for a long time, that I was in therapy, but I didn't really have a therapist who could handle it.
That was going to be my next question, was how do you, for that exact reason, like how do you find clinicians? Do you have to find specialty clinicians to manage the healing?
The more specialty they had, the worse they were. That was my experience.
Interesting.
The more they were expert in dealing with sexual abuse, the worse they were, because the more their ego was involved, and the
Mhm.
more they needed to be needed, and the more they needed me to be their little, you know,
Wow. Yeah.
victim client. No, I found someone who was open. That was really, and who was all I needed, was someone who was going to be there for me, with me. In the beginning, it was really important that she was not going to write a book, that
Hmm.
my story was not going to be in any kind of book, that she was going to like get the credit. um no, my therapist has 10 years of being with therapists who couldn't really hold it,
Yeah.
couldn't handle it. And then some that projected onto me, others that it just was clear that there was this invisible wall where we could not thread. Others that just told me they didn't believe me.
That's what they said. I just don't believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
What did that feel like to not be believed?
Well, at that point, I knew. So I thought that's a really bad therapist.
Well, there, yeah, there you go. There you go.
um, but but yeah, no, in many ways, there was always this guilt complex that came back, that it's at the end of the day, everything has to be my fault. And at the end of the day, I'm too much. It's my problem. That was always the message. The people that with the invisible wall was in a way the hardest, because I didn't even try to say anything,
Mm,
but I knew I couldn't go there. That was there, this unspoken contract, in our dynamic. She was going to help with the sexual abuse, the incest, but not with the mother, and not not with
right. Right. There
anything more
were
severe.
rules.
Yeah. And they had to remain unspoken, and that was hard. That was very hard, because it left me, I knew there was more,
Hmm.
but I thought it was my problem. And that's originally, it's always my problem. Yeah.
Right. 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 You kind of back to square one with that. What kind of therapies did you do? Did you, obviously the talk therapy was a part. Did you do any other? Did you do EMDR? Have you tried any novel approaches that work, or are you seeing novel approaches work?
Yeah, so for me, it was never the approach or the system. It was always the person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ended up, so what worked for me was when a person was fully present with me,
Mm-hmm.
when they were open, and it didn't matter what they did. So yeah, most of it was psychotherapy. I had some hypnotherapy as well, to help me, that was together with a therapist who wanted me to help uncover instances of sexual trauma. So, but she was the one who was not open to the ritual or any kind of the organized abuse. So I ended up remembering things that were connected to the organized abuse, but not itself, the
Right.
organized
Okay.
abuse, like the pimp who had also raped me. And then something that was a little bit on the side of it. It was not, there was a rape that was not really directly these three boys. It was not direct, it was connected to the network, but it was
Right.
not in the network. So I remember that.
Right.
And I remembered the pimp. And then I remembered another instance of incest at first. And that was through the hypnotherapy. And it was very professionally done. It was very well, guided. And but it was always the person that helped me to feel not only safe, but also that there was room for anything. And that was rare.
Mm. Right. You have to have someone who's done their own work.
Yes, exactly. And my therapist, who became like the second mother, who was that person who had no knowledge of any of this, had never heard of it, but she was open. And so that's where I had most of the most difficult, let's say, the first memories of these horrors. And she could hold it. And I was going every day by then.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also going to yoga. So I did it. So I had to always deal with, so I had this good therapist, but I had her only for 8 years. And then I had yoga. Well, forget about how yoga's taught. That was really unhelpful. Most of the time I was like, don't touch, or whatever it was not working in terms of the way that it was taught. So when I started going into the prisons to teach yoga there and have this and when I was creating that organization that I ended up going into the prisons with, it was really important that I was not going to do what was done to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I started to develop what is really the unconditional model, is a way to be as a provider so that you can be that person that people feel safe with. And often a good-hearted person is already there, but there's ways in which we are taught to hold space that are often not helpful. And so it just addresses all of these ways, all of the ways in which you do the work on yourself, but it's in this context of changing the world, of changing the world by changing yourself. It was at the time, I wasn't really finding, like 2010, around then, I wasn't, I'd had a lot of healing. I did, exactly. Yoga brought me back into my body. That's really what it did. So powerful in that way. But then again, so many obstacles in the way that I was taught. But I knew that it was helpful, and I wanted to share it in that way. So very soon after I started going into the jails, we went into jails, prisons, state prisons, federal prisons, all over New York. And soon after I had started teaching at Rikers Island, I started a group for sex trafficked women. Well, a lot of those women, and the reason I started that particular program was together with the Department of Health, in fact, was that the women were caught, they were picked up by the police, and then they were jailed. But they were only picked up because they were refusing to name their traffickers, really, or their pimps. So the Department of Health was saying that obviously they don't trust doctors, they don't trust most people. So I started a program with those women to help them get out of the system altogether, because most of them, there was not a single woman there that was just a sex worker because she wanted to do that.
Right.
They
Right.
were all abused as children. So many had started to be trafficked right from the foster system.
Right. Right.
And so they were all trafficking victims. And that was a very powerful group. And we were not doing physical yoga. We just met as a group, and it was just, and so the healing that happened there was so beautiful and powerful, and people did feel strengthened to speak out and got into programs where they were protected, because of course the reason they don't give these names is because they are going to be killed if they do, or they are going to be punished severely. So they were several of them went into safe programs where they did well.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. I'm sure that felt really good.
Felt great. And still, even though their experiences were often extreme, it still wasn't the same. It still wasn't satanic ritual abuse.
Right.
It still wasn't on the level of, no, had been, a lot of them had been in contact with murder and so forth, but it was still on a different, these psychopaths, absolutely, but on that small scale level, not on the global psychopath level. So that was more, I always knew that I was going to be working more with those people. And I guess once I started to speak out, which was while I was also going into the prisons, I started to speak out publicly. And then that is how people started coming to me. And soon after, and I still have this group, a chat group really, for survivors of SRA, which is satanic ritual abuse. This is SRA, and mind control, which is MC. A private chat group, for example, I run that. And of course, I do a lot in that sphere now. And today, I'm not in the prisons anymore, and I'm actually working exclusively with survivors of most of the people that I see that I counsel are survivors of this.
What are some of the resources out there for people who either have been through this and want to talk about it, or maybe are trying to get out and have no idea where to go, where to start, what to do?
Well, to get out is absolutely very difficult. And it just is. But I have on my website, it's annikelucas.com, there is a resource page. So there's quite a few resources right there. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. We're going to link that in the show notes. And for people who are interested, where can they find your book?
So my book is on Amazon, although it's best also to go to my website.
Okay.
And there is it's right on the homepage, but also a special book link for every country, because it's on Amazon, but it supposedly you cannot find it when you look for it on Amazon in the all category. You have to go to the book category and then search it, because if you just go and do a general search on Amazon, it just doesn't show up, or only the Kindle version shows up, but not the book.
Well, you're incredible. Your story is incredible. And I think that it brings us to this place where we get to look at what is and not what we want things to be necessarily, and then how we can contribute even when it feels too big for us to be a part of, because I think that's where a lot of us go, oh, I can't, like there's nothing I can do. I have to get my dry cleaning, I have to whatever. And I love that you're challenging people to say, okay, yeah, you do, but also if you open your eyes about this, maybe there'll be an opportunity for you to be of service to people. And that's what I'm hearing, is like, there may be an opportunity for all of us to be of service. We just have to be open.
Yes, to be open. I think ultimately that this is a spiritual war.
Yeah.
Like we're talking about Satanism,
Mm-hmm.
what's on the other side of that? So, in a way, the reason that I can feel some compassion for those psychopaths that are still operative is because they have no access to their own soul. They have no access to spirit at all. And it's like they've cut off a part of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's that they've been pushed outside of themselves, if that makes sense. Like there's the material self, the body, the physical body, and then everything is done to keep that body comfortable and to keep that as that person to have that power in the world, because what's lacking is spirit. And this is not religion, but spirit, that there are finer and subtler energies. I'm not talking, that when we turn to the within, when we go within, when we have the strength to go within, there is this natural connection to spirit that happens. I think you can't go within unless you have some connection to spirit.
Right. Right.
And so it is a battle, a spiritual battle in that sense, that through experience and knowing ourselves as more than the body, that we can find what it is that we can do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm very, very grateful to you that you chose to speak out and were willing to come and talk to me about this. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope that your journey continues to be as powerful and rewarding as it has been to this point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.